about why should policymakers care about people's well-being, where after all this morning and this beginning of the afternoon, I think this is no longer a question, but still it was posed like that on the agenda, so I'm repeating what it is. I hope we're all convinced that there are good reasons for policymakers to care about people's well-being. So but I'm going to call on the panelists to join me on this podium. So Minister Ohood Al-Roumi, a Minister of State for Happiness from United Arab Emirates, please. Eva Christiansen, I saw that you just arrived. You got right on time from the German Chancellery. Mr. Oliver Letwin, please. Former UK Cabinet Minister, and Vincent Aussilloux from France, from France Stratégie. So as you can see, we have a very good panel coming from very different countries of the world, and we will get some perspectives which I hope will be different, but nonetheless will probably converge. But what will be interesting is to put in perspective these different approaches in different countries and understand a little bit better what has motivated policymakers to actually engage into this agenda. And I'm going to start, so I'm going to ask each of the panelists to speak for about 10 minutes, 8-10 minutes, and explain to us and give us some background to the initiative that they are representing, or that they are most familiar with, coming from their countries. And then I'll follow up with some questions, and then we will open the floor for discussion. So I'd like to start with you, Minister, if you don't mind. And already by having a Minister of State for Happiness, I think is something that is quite remarkable. So perhaps you want to share with us how this all came about, and actually what is your ministry in charge of doing?
Thank you, Martine. It really gives me great pleasure to be among you this afternoon. In February 2016, the United Arab Emirates witnessed its largest cabinet reshuffle. And new and unique ministerial posts were introduced. So we have Minister of State for Youth. She's only 22 years old. We have Minister of State for Tolerance, Minister for the Future, and myself, Minister of State for Happiness. So I was appointed the Minister of State for Happiness with the assignment of aligning public policy in order to make sure that we have happy, healthy, and positive society. And I'm really happy to be here among you to talk about the United Arab Emirates approach towards happiness. So how do we define the relationship or the perspective of governments towards happiness? Of course, we understand that happiness is a personal choice, but I think government can work on the enabling environment, whether providing good education services, health services, job opportunities, economic growth, sense of security, to give people the opportunity to empower them to choose to be happy. Because I think the main work of the government is happiness. It's not additional to the work of the government. It is the core business of any government. Happiness, whether you call it happiness or well-being or life satisfaction, I will use the magic word, H word, happiness, since I am the Minister of Happiness. So how do we do that in the United Arab Emirates? We do that through the National Program for Happiness and Positivity. And we added the word positivity to our program because we believe a positive person is by default is a happy person, is hopeful of the future, and can see, or she or he can see the possibilities of the future. So we have the 3 pillars for our program. The first pillar is how can we make happiness and positivity part of work, whether government work or private work. And we have 3 sub-pillars for the first pillar. The first one is programs and policies. So all government policies and programs should be geared towards happiness. And when I say happiness, it's most happiness for most people. We're talking about the long term, about the sustainable happiness. Actually, right now, we're working on a policy manual for all government entities to help them develop their policies with the perspective of happiness in mind. So telling them that happiness is your core business. Why are we building hospitals? To provide healthcare services. Why are we providing healthcare services? For people to live healthy life. Why are we doing this? So they can enjoy their life and ultimately be happy. So happiness is the core business for any government. And also trying to encourage them to launch programs and initiatives geared towards achieving the happiness in the society. The second sub-pillar is services. Governments around the world have more than 7 billion customers that we need to take care of. So we're talking about customer happiness. By the way, we don't have any service centers back home in the UAE. We call them happiness centers. And we develop manuals, training programs for our happiness agents. We don't call them service agents, on how to make the customers happy. Because services are very important. It's the daily interaction between the people and the government. And the third sub-pillar is the work environment. So we would like to create happy and positive work environment, whether in the private sector or the government sector. You know better than me that a happy worker is more energized, is more productive. So if we would like to improve productivity and performance for the government and the private sector and enhance our competitiveness, so it's very important that we create happy and positive work environment, whether in the government or the private sector. The second pillar is measurement. And we heard this morning that GDP is not sufficient to measure the prosperity or the success of countries. And we believe that the future will be for the countries who can transform the economic growth into well-being. We're trying to do that on 3 levels. Measuring the happiness of our customers. So we have something called happiness meters in all service centers and across all service channels, where we have instant feedback of the customers. And we know, like, for example, Ministry of Health, their customer happiness today is 70%, Ministry of Education. So we have live data about the customer of our happiness. Also, we launched a survey to measure the happiness and positivity of the government employees, and we're doing that with Gallup. The third part is actually today, we launched the field work for the National Survey for Happiness and Positivity. And thank you, Martine. The OECD guidelines for measuring the subjective well-being was very useful for us on compiling the survey. The survey will cover more than 14,000 people in the UAE. And my scope covers all nationalities in the United Arab Emirates. We host more than 200 nationalities in the UAE. So we are measuring the happiness drivers for all segments, for all nationalities. This will be our national baseline, and we will use it to develop the UAE framework for happiness and positivity, and use it also as an input for different ministries so they can imply it and use it in formulating their policies and programs and initiatives. The third pillar of the national program is how can we make happiness and positivity a lifestyle? All of us are in pursuit of happiness. How can we empower people to choose to be happy? Through providing them with information and knowledge from the community to the community. And let me share with you one initiative that we launched with Dubai schools. It's called 100 Days of Positivity. So we're trying to encourage students to practice positivity, promoting virtues, so they develop the resilience, and it becomes a life skill for them. So they can face the life challenges with resilience and still bounce back and look at the positive side of things. So what we're trying to do, Martine, in the UAE is to bring happiness and positivity from just a broad development framework into a daily practice for government work and for our society.
Thank you very much. This is really happiness in practice. I think that's very good, because we had those very high-level discussions throughout the morning, but here we see that you can really deliver. Minister, can I follow up with one question before I give the floor to Mrs. Christiansen, which is, how have you managed, first of all, where was the leadership coming from, and how did you manage, or how are you managing to get all the levels, or all the government departments aligned with, you mentioned health and education. How do you go about bringing this horizontality, if I may say, I use this word, into this process of happiness and positivity? Are you leading the other government departments because you are the Minister of State for Happiness, or how is it working, again, in practice, how the government is organized?
Okay, thank you, Martine. So I don't have a ministry for myself. I'm Minister of State for Happiness. I'm hosted at the Prime Minister's office, where I have my other role as the Director General. And this is not by coincidence, it is by design. So I use my role as the Director General of the Prime Minister's Office, which is the center of government in the United Arab Emirates, to do the policy alignment. So we do the coordination between the different entities. And in the United Arab Emirates, for each government plan or initiative or a service, we have a KPI linked to the national performance system, which we manage in the Prime Minister's office. So my role in the Prime Minister's office is really helping me in my other role as Minister of State for Happiness. But in addition to that, we have introduced a couple of arrangements within the government to help us do the policy coordination. For example, we have Happiness Council in each ministry. And this council is headed by the minister himself or herself. And the role of this council is to make sure that all the government policies and programs are geared to, or the entities, the entity itself, program and services are geared towards achieving the happiness of the society. In addition to that, we have screening tool for our cabinet. So before any entity submit a policy or a regulation or program to the cabinet, it has to be filtered through the happiness and positivity lens. And also, we have appointed chief happiness and positivity officers in all government entities. They are trained by the Greater Good Science Center in UC Berkeley, and also would like to thank the What Works Wellbeing Center here in the UK for helping us training them. So those chief happiness and positivity officers are our agents. They are the coordination mechanism between us as the National Program for Happiness and Positivity and their entities, and they are also helping their ministers, for example, in terms of initiative related to the society or creating happy and positive initiatives with their entities. So it's systematic and institutionalized.
That's very impressive, I think. We'll hear more in the second panel, this sort of approaches, but I think this is quite comprehensive and looks indeed very impressive. We'll come back with more questions afterwards, but I would like now to give the floor to Eva Christiansen. You are an advisor to Chancellor Merkel, you work in the Chancellery, and without you being present, we already talked about Germany this morning, saying how Germany has embarked into this very wide consultation on trying to find out what matters to people in terms of their quality of life, their well-being in Germany. So please tell us a little bit more about that.
Thank you very much. At the beginning of this legislative period, the German government decided to implement a strategy called Wellbeing in Germany, What Matters to Us. The objective was to align even more closely with the priorities of people and to put well-being at the center of our policies. But the government chose a special approach. We wanted to focus at first on a dialogue with people about their understanding of well-being, and then after that use the finding of this dialogue to develop an indicator system for the government for well-being in Germany. With the national dialogue, we wanted to reach as many and as diverse a mix of people as possible. We wanted to discuss in an open-ended way. So in every event, there were only 2 opening questions. How do you define well-being for your personal, and how do you define well-being for society as a whole? And the government wanted to participate in the dialogue with all members of the government. Therefore, we asked for support from a large number of societal groups to participate in the dialogue. Churches, religious groups, we discussed in universities, schools, welfare associations, employers, and unions. And we asked them to organize the events on their own, and we only helped to record the findings. In addition to that, we started a website where everybody could discuss these topics, and a postcard campaign, a very old-fashioned measure, but it was very successful, surprisingly, where everybody could send us their views on well-being. And we organized special events trying to reach people who usually do not participate in such civic dialogues. We discussed in old people's homes, we discussed with disabled persons, with disadvantaged young people. And all ministers and the Chancellor herself participated in events about well-being as well. The Chancellor attended 4 events. For example, we discussed with 100 people who were chosen by a representative panel. We discussed in another event with school students. We discussed in a town in West Germany where there's high unemployment and a high number of immigrants. And she discussed in a dialogue, especially with tradespersons and entrepreneurs. After a 6-month period, we started the dialogue last year in April and ended the dialogue in October 2015. There were 203 events in all regions of Germany. In big cities, in the rural areas, people discussed in small groups or in bigger town hall meetings. And 50 of these 203 events were joined by the member of the government, so that we reached around about 60,000 people who actively participated in the dialogue. Diversity was an important goal for us, but the dialogue was not representative in a scientific way. However, the great variety of the groups which participated in gave us a very good picture of social priorities of people in Germany. Then, to be transparent, an independent academic team analyzed all the answers and opinions. They documented the diverse issues in full detail and classified them, and this analysis was finished at the end of 2015. And perhaps let me give you some examples of aspects which were mentioned most frequently. The first or the most mentioned topic was peace, viewed as the key requirement for well-being in Germany. People discussed global responsibilities, and they had a high awareness of the correlation between global situation and their personal well-being. Of course, there were a lot of social and economic topics that were discussed, like level of payment for work, access to health care, equal opportunities in the educational system, fair distribution of income, also greater amounts of living space at affordable prices, and work-life balance. People also discussed the circumstances of living together. A very main important topic for good well-being was mentioned, secure life and protection from crime. And people discussed the common values, tolerance, respect, and integration very, very emotionally. So we had a great variety of different facets of well-being, and that was the basis for our governmental report. Of course, we took into consideration the latest research on well-being and national and international reference projects. So with all that, we identified 12 dimensions of well-being. Most of the dimensions are used also in other reports as well: income, health, education, environment. Just a few examples. But learning from the dialogue led us to identify 3 less common dimensions: work-life balance, aspects of secure life and protection from crime, and aspects of personal freedom and democracy. Per every dimension, we chose 3 to 5 indicators. In summary, we now have 46 indicators. Again, of course, a lot of well-established indicators: GDP, national debt ratio, life expectancy, air pollution, and so on. But we also add some indicators which are more closely linked to people's everyday lives. We chose commuting time, fear of crime, job satisfaction, membership in sports club, and opportunity to influence a policy. The cabinet, the report passed the cabinet just 6 weeks ago. We were very glad that we managed that. And it shows a broad variety of well-being aspects in different areas, differentiated by gender, age, regional aspects. And it shows the complexities that government faces in working on well-being issues. What are the conclusions? In a lot of topics, Germany, I could say, is in good shape. A high life expectancy, a low unemployment rate. We reduced the number of early school leavers, just a few examples. But there are indicators which show that we have to work on. Education and mobility, as the OECD often mentioned, and the fear of crime, the voters' turnout. And there were, in some cases, difficulties to find appropriate indicators for what people mentioned. So we have a placeholder for quality of care because there's not enough data at the moment to have a good indicator for that. What comes next? The government, now at the end of the legislative period, the report is the first edition, and the government plans to update it regularly once per legislative period. It should and will form the basis for developing policy measures on well-being to maintain and improve well-being. And our aim is and was to stimulate a debate with all societal forces on all political levels in Germany, and we also welcome a broad discussion in science, and here I am, and we could discuss it. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting to see that your process has come to an end, and that was quite a very impressive process. But it's said that your report is now, which is, by the way, called Gut Leben in Deutschland, so has now gone to the government, to the cabinet. How has it been? It's public, so how has it been received by the community and the people who've participated, in particular, in all those town hall meetings? Have you got a sense of how well, if that reflects well their preoccupations, and if you've captured what matters for well-being and for them? But also, I'd like to ask a question, because we've been talking this morning, we've been discussing a lot the issue of subjective well-being, how people feel about their life, how they evaluate their life. And I've noted, of course, my German is not that good, but I looked at the report and I looked at your dashboard of 46 odd indicators, and I didn't find that there was, among those indicators, you have chosen to put a life satisfaction indicator. So perhaps you can, is that because it did not feature highly in the dialogues, or people didn't feel like they did not express themselves in those terms, or was it a deliberate choice, or what? But can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, I agree with the minister that for us, well-being and life satisfaction or happiness is a very personal thing, and the German public is very sensitive about that. the government decided that we don't want to influence personal life satisfaction, but we can influence and we can improve conditions for a better life for people. So we decided not to choose life satisfaction as a personal indicator. We chose some subjective indicators, which are more concrete, fear of crime, job satisfaction, I think the opportunity to influence policy. But in different tasks, but not as a general measure, because that's not our that wouldn't be our approach.
Okay.
And the question of in the public, yes. As a spokesperson and a media advisor, I must say I was the reception in the media was pretty good because it was not only critical, because the journalists really recognize that we take the views and perspectives of people seriously. And also their critics. We have a lot of quotes in the report of participants of the dialogue. I would say and there is they criticize that there are no policy measures from that report, and I think that's a point, because we are now at the end of the legislative period. That's the job for a new government. But a lot of media said this could be a compass for policy measures for improving well-being, and so I'm satisfied or satisfied.
So you've created a new GPS to some extent for policy making in the future. So let's now, I'm sure there will be many questions for you from the audience, but let's now turn to Mr. Oliver Letwin. You were in cabinet when David Cameron launched the National Wellbeing Initiative. So again, we'd like to hear from you what motivated his initiative and thinking, or captured his imagination, and understand a little bit better what led to this process and that of his team of advisors. We have another person here who were there at the time, but since you're on the, David Halpern is with us. But perhaps we'd like to hear your views on how you saw this initiative in the UK, if you can tell us a little bit more retrospectively how it came about.
Well, actually, I don't think that is what I really want to talk about.
I would then talk about what you want then.
I want to take up where you left off, because I think that's the bit I can add to this conversation usefully. We've heard two very, very impressive descriptions of a route march to incorporating or focusing, even in the case of the UAE, well-being within the government's apparatus and policy intent. I don't think that's where we are in the UK at all at the moment, and I think it's important to understand why not and what we're trying to do about it, but also the difficulties, because I think this conversation is otherwise at risk of making it sound as though this is much easier than certainly we found it. I mean, it's the answer to the question that the panel was posed, should well-being matter to governments, is so blindingly obviously yes, that you wonder why we're having this conference. But I take it that everybody's here for some reason or other. That's because, as a matter of fact, although it's blindingly obviously yes, and except to the extent you believe that deontological rights supervene on the greatest happiness, the greatest number, it's sort of the only concern of government in any rational world, it is not the case that governments, even in the most liberal democratic societies, have typically thought in these terms, or indeed that politics has been conducted as a debate about these matters. In fact, we found exactly the reverse. If you talk in Britain, and my impression is that this is true actually in many other parts of the democratic world, if you talk in debate about things like beauty or happiness, or life satisfaction or well-being, it doesn't take more than about 15 seconds before you're dismissed as an eccentric lunatic. Whereas if you talk about GDP, which interestingly we didn't really measure in the 19th century, it's a relatively recent phenomenon, but if you talk about that, it's okay. If you talk about buying weapons or building hospitals or constructing rail lines or something, that is legit. That's okay. That you're allowed to talk about. You can even talk about protecting people against crime or things of that sort. But if you ever mention the end result that you're trying to achieve in terms in which this discussion has been, I think, rightly couched, which Richard Laird has tremendously promoted from the outside in this country, and Gus O'Donnell and others promoted from the inside for many years, you are regarded, as I say, as wildly eccentric. It's not the only such case. David Halpern here, when we first got into discussion with one another in 2010, was plugging with Gus's support the idea of behavioral insights, and that was regarded also as lunatically eccentric at the time. So it's not surprising that we have this sort of cognitive dissonance, but nevertheless it is the case. That causes a real problem, because speaking admittedly as a sort of politicians usually regarded as lunatically eccentric for all sorts of reasons, nevertheless, it's inconvenient if you go on some TV program and the net result is that the few people that continue watching to the end before they turn off the sound regard you afterwards as engaged in some zany activity. It's very inconvenient as a politician. And so what politicians do is to react to that by not doing it. And so the whole debate goes back to its comfort zone discussion about these chunky items where you can measure it and you can have violent arguments about it, and you can explain that the other guy is terrible and you're great and so on. All the sort of apparatus which has lowered our democracies and continues to do so. And so the question we faced was, how do we try to shift that? And the only thing we could really think of doing was to make it, and I admit that this is bizarre, but nevertheless, is to make it sound like it wasn't qualitative, but was quantitative. Now, of course, in fact, well-being is entirely qualitative. It's hopelessly naive to suppose that you can ultimately quantify in a sort of completely philosophically coherent and comprehensive and accurate way how happy somebody is, though Richard has over the years tried to, I think, very powerfully argue that on the whole, if you ask someone whether they're happy, if they tell you they're happy, they're probably happy, and if they tell you they're not, they're probably not. So you can get some quantification in a digital sense, but how happy I am, I mean, interpersonal comparisons of felicity have puzzled utilitarian theory for 200 years. And somebody is still trying to win the Nobel Prize for Economics by measuring it, but they've never managed. So actually, this is not in the end probably reducible, certainly not now, reducible actually to quantity, but we came to the conclusion that if we could get it all highly quantified and get lots of people who are called statisticians in lots of official agencies and supported by people around the world and by august bodies like the OECD and the IMF and the World Bank and so on and so forth, then actually maybe someone would take this seriously. Just like with GDP. I mean, the fact is, anybody who knows how GDP figures are concocted knows that all GDP figures are junk.
Yes, I know that.
They can't even make the different methods of calculating GDP add up to the same number. It's hopeless when you start looking at how they're done. But we all pay great heed to GDP figures. Why? Because they are statistically collected, independently verified, used, discussed. So we thought, well, maybe we could achieve the same shift here. Maybe we could get to the position where over time, and it obviously is a slow process, it can't happen overnight, but over time, the annual collection that the Deputy Secretary General was showing us of statistics here, which we instituted some years ago, would gradually build up a data bank that would become part, or could become part, of live political discussion, enter the debate. And the good news, which I think you were hearing this morning, is that decision itself has not been criticised by any political party in the UK, as far as I'm aware. Sadly, I think the reason is most were not interested in the subject. From time to time, bits of the media have expressed huge skepticism about all of this, and it wouldn't take more than 5 seconds to get them to be very skeptical, but mainly they've just ignored it. So what's happened is that the statisticians are plodding on in a very good way, and maybe gradually we will get to a base of data which enables the public discussion to assimilate this seriously, and hence not just to be talking about GDP and other things which we are already measuring, but to be beginning to discuss whether, as a matter of fact, doing X rather than Y, if the what work centers and other mechanisms show it's not actually producing greater felicity or well-being or whatever, it's only producing some other intermediate measure, maybe that could lead to a shift of policy in the future. So my message is, I don't think at the moment we are actually really driving policy through this lens, but I think it is possible that in the future we will achieve a position where democratic politicians can get traction by reference to a set of data which are, even if in some senses naive, nevertheless respectable and internationally comparable, and hence used in the political debate.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think it was very good to have this grain of salt, because among ourselves we all perhaps too much convinced that we can go ahead. On the other hand, I mean, just perhaps from where I sit, and this is not as a chair, but perhaps as a personal comment on what you just said, I think this idea that because something is qualitative or more has more of a sense of quality rather than quantity, and it's less easy to measure, you can't measure. I think we have to go beyond that, because you can get very valid information on something, a concept that is qualitative that you try to measure. So it's not because inherently you have something qualitative that you can't measure it. That's what I want to say. You can actually do that, and you can draw some valuable information. At least that's what we found out. But anyhow, what's very important, though, is that when you have this kind of conversation, I can very well see where the skepticism can be coming from, and in fact that's what Germany has tried to escape to some extent, not entering into this. Is what we all discussed this morning, is that what we tried to do is try to see what are the drivers. And the drivers, I think that politicians of well-being or happiness or whatever, the drivers, I think that everybody will recognize. The question is, how much priority do you put on all of those drivers? And that's what the conversation will change how the conversation will change if you put well-being as sort of the ultimate objective, as opposed to GDP or growth. And in particular, as we discussed this morning, putting a little more emphasis on child emotional skills as opposed to just cognitive skills, because of course, cognitive skills will be good for growth and for productivity and for so on. And so it changes the conversation somehow. And I'm sure that politicians must, to some extent, be interested in this sort of debate, whether you've measured subjective well-being or not. But if the whole of the studies have shown that it is also and mental health matters very much, you can still drive a conversation among politicians around this, can't you? Or is it a lost cause?
Well, I don't think it is ultimately, or anyway, we don't think we have any evidence yet that it is ultimately a lost cause. I travel hopefully. And I do think that by assembling measures, and we could have a very long philosophical discussion about the question of whether you can directly measure qualitatively, but at least decent proxies, statistically, I hope will get to the point where people do begin to engage in the discussion in a less two-dimensional way, a way less dominated just by very bald statistics of objective conditions. And I think the real issue here is how you move from what is already incredibly important to our fellow citizens into what is accepted in the political dialogue. There is a disjunction here. And if you go into one of the villages in my own constituency, and you start talking about issues of well-being, what the place looks like, what the place feels like, how the grandmothers are being looked after or not looked after by the people next door to them, so on. These are things totally of interest.
Yes.
You can pack the village hall talking about these things in a way that you certainly could not if you wanted to talk about the GDP or something. But as soon as you get away from the direct contact between the local politician and the local people into the TV studios and the newspapers and into the big democratic airwave debate, you lose all that.
Yeah.
And so the question, I think, is how we rescue what is really the matter that concerns people in their own lives into the political debate. And I think some of what we've been seeing in the last year, and may see more of in the next year or so, precisely arises from the fact that politics has got disjoined from what really matters to people in their own lives.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you that, but we'll come back to that later on. But indeed, you as politicians have a great responsibility to, and the media probably, to actually redo those links, because otherwise we are bound to see the sort of results in elections that we saw in the US here and elsewhere in Europe and elsewhere. But we are now going to move to France, where we have some. France will be interesting. We'll hear from Vincent Aussilloux, who is working for France Stratégie, which is a body which is attached to the Prime Minister in France and does some longer-term thinking, but interestingly have been involved also in consulting the population and coming up with new indicators to drive the political process. But it will be interesting because perhaps it's probably a combination of everything that we heard already. So let's hear from France.
Thank you. Yes, indeed, I was struck by the fact that we come from the very same starting point. Basically, is that we are all very unsatisfied by the fact that the public debate is focusing on GDP and a few other indicators, and generally the indicators the public debate or the media is focusing on usually are not of very good quality. They are not the best indicators to what we want to measure. So basically, informed by the experience of other countries and also the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi report of 2009, how to measure economic efficiency and social progress. We basically decided to launch a very similar exercise to the one Eva just described, except that it was probably on a very much smaller scale and a time span which was also shorter over the course of 6 months. I must say it was not a government initiative. It was an initiative of France Stratégie, the institution I'm working in, which is indeed part of the Prime Minister administration, but we get our sort of independence in terms of defining our work program. And also an initiative of a joint, another institution, the Social, Economic and Environmental Council, which is the equivalent in France of a third parliament chamber. And basically, we decided to launch together the exercise to make a proposal to the government for a short list of indicators to measure, not to measure exactly happiness or well-being, but more the wealth of the country in a large, in a broad definition sense. And basically, this came timely as one of the member of parliament took the initiative to propose an act on basically asking the government to complement GDP with wealth indicators. So that law came to parliament and was voted with no opposition. It went also to Senate and no opposition vote. So basically a wide support to the whole process. And so basically when we came with this proposal and the consultation of the wider public, well, the government was, of course, quite happy that we already undertook that exercise and that they could sort of base their work on this initiative. So maybe a slight difference from the German approach is that it was not seen where we were doing the exercise as a government initiative. It was seen as a sort of a more, I wouldn't say bottom-up, because not such like, but basically more sort of civil society and other type of representative institutions doing this work. So we basically quite classically undertook online consultation. We also managed to have a poll representative of the French population, workshop with citizens. Of course, at the end, we had a vote by the Economic, Social and Environmental Council. And we put on ourselves the constraint to limit the number of indicators to 10, actually, because, as I said at the beginning, what we wanted is to have alternative indicators in the public debate to complement GDP and basically to replace some of the indicators that are commonly used. In the public debate, generally you have, of course, GDP, but you have the unemployment rate, inflation, public debt, and we thought that in order for these indicators to flourish and be used by the media and hence has an influence on public policy design, we needed to limit ourselves to a small number, and we needed to basically replace some of the indicators like public debt, for example, which is not well, at the end of the process, which did not come up as a key indicator. It's rather public and private debt as a whole, as an indication of basically the legacy that we are transmitting to the next generations in terms of yeah, well, I can't find the word just now, but a sort of well, a legacy in a way, a negative sort of a burden that they would have to deal with. Of course, in front of this negative burden, we had the proposal to have an indicator measuring investment, the productive investment. At the end, in the dialogue with the government, because when we came up with these 10 indicators through the consultation process, the government decided to retain most of them, but change one or two in the list. The one on productive investment was replaced by an indicator measuring R&D investment. So you can argue in favor or against that, but I mean, that was their choice. So now, by law, the government has the obligation to publish a report every year, basically a scoreboard on how the country is doing with regard to these indicators. So that has happened twice since then, in October 2015 and last October. And by law as well, the government has to basically measure the potential impact of legislative initiative, the new laws, regarding the 10 dimensions, basically, as far as possible. Of course, it's not possible now to have all the dimensions measured in a scientific way for each and every law. But we are trying to expand, basically, the number of indicators that are included in the impact assessment study, so ex-ante evaluation. We are also expanding the number of indicators from that list, which are used in what we call the socio-economic evaluation, which are compulsory for every big investment project. For now, I mean, 6 dimensions are already covered. We're trying to expand the number. It's mainly developed for transport infrastructure investment. We are still struggling to basically expand the number of investment projects in other areas that would basically undergo the ex-ante assessment, impact assessment using these wealth indicators. But we are working on that. We're also working in another dimension, which is public policy efficiency, where basically now we are expanding the number of indicators. Well, not expanding them, but basically merging the already existing indicators, which are already included in public policy efficiency evaluation, to basically converge toward the list of 10 indicators. So this is an ongoing work, but I believe it's something that will have quite some impact on public policy, because of course administrations are then assessed against these indicators, and if they have to report each and every year on their basically their achievements with regard to these indicators, then there will be a strong sort of incentive for them to gradually cover every dimension, and of course gradually improve the way they deliver. So these are those of the examples of basically areas where we are pushing for these indicators to have an influence in policy making. Maybe to stop here, maybe to leave some time to the discussion. I think one important point is that at the beginning, the government was criticized for looking at each text only for a sort of a narrow angle. A text, an act on, for example, to try to fight against unemployment was looked at only from the side of the unemployment effect, impact, potential impact. Now they are widening the dimensions, and they are assessing the text on the full list of indicators whenever possible. And of course, now it's for us, I think also the community of researchers and scientists and the OECD as well, to develop the tools basically for the ones that we have developed over time to assess the impact of such measures on GDP, or now we have good models as well, more and more on the carbon footprint, for example, of certain policy decisions. We need to do that in all the dimensions that we are covering in these wealth indicators, and that's work which is still in front of us.
Thank you very much, Vincent. I think we'll hear more in the second panel about the sort of initiative that are similar to the French initiative. But it was good to have you on that panel to show how these processes have gone about to come up with new indicators, but also new ways of doing cost-benefit analysis, because this is essentially, I mean, those are ex-ante. You say we're missing some models and some tools of ex-ante cost-benefit analysis, but also you're trying to do that ex post as well. But I'd like to ask you a question before I give the floor to the audience, because you said this is now the second report, and indeed that it was just published not that long ago. Do you feel, in the light of what we heard of this sort of skepticism in the UK and not being very serious if you try to do this sort of things, how much is it actually changing the? You said in government department it seems to be having an impact gradually, at least, but how much is it changing also the approach that the politicians are having? Because frankly, those two reports haven't. I mean, in France, they haven't made the first hits in the media, and we haven't heard any politicians during this sort of pre-campaign in France talking of any of this. So we haven't heard that. So why is it so? Was it difficult because you look lunatic and eccentric if you talk about it, or is this because it's just too recent? It's only 2 years, and it will come about after some time.
I believe it's the last reason. It's probably because it's recent and probably now is seen by the wider public and mainly by the media as something done by this government. So why should we trust them to report on indicators they have chosen themselves? I think the tests will be for the next government, whether they will continue that initiative and basically apply the same criteria to assess the effectiveness of their decisions, and or whether they will just abandon it and move to something totally different. I think we will try to convince them that they need to stick to this exercise because there is value in trying to measure against objective indicators, and well, hopefully, then it will gain a little bit more sort of visibility if they decide to go ahead and keep the same type of indicators.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So the test will be whether, in fact, any of the initiatives actually we've heard the agenda is actually moving forward, is whether it's also embraced by the next government, whatever the next government, whoever it will be in the next government, because there seems to be sense of what we heard this morning associated with this famous issue of trust, which is something that we've been discussing this morning, but seems to be so important in all this discussion, the trust that we have in government in being able to actually change people's life effectively and improve people's well-being. So I'm now going to open the floor for discussion. I think there are I can see all this. So we'll go this way. So we'll do John, and then okay, we go there, and then we move to the left part of the room. So Susie, if you can give the floor, he has the floor. So John, please. Please introduce. It's not because I say John that everybody knows you. So please introduce yourself.
I'm John Hall from the United Nations.
Yeah, can you stand up?
John Hall from the United Nations Development Programme. I think the policies, the philosophy, the data are all really important. But one thing that there is some evidence around the world of where this has been done previously is that discussions about well-being can bring government close to citizens and can have some hidden benefits that can be surprising, and they can also, looking at things through the lens of well-being, can bring government departments together in different ways and can break down some of these silos that exist where often departments compete rather than collaborate. Have any of the people on stage seen evidence of that in their own projects that have surprised them?
Okay, we can get a few more. So Paul here in front, can you give him, Charles? I'll give you get the microphone afterwards.
Okay, Paul Vrijters, LSE. I have a question for Oliver. Hello, Oliver. So I was intrigued about the way that you spoke about research and data being effectively a form of magic to smuggle in reasonable statements about well-being into politics. Now, that is pretty much how I see things, but I was never taught that way, and there's no way I could tell students that that is the way things work. So the essential question is, in what forum can such type of high-level strategies be discussed? Because I think this is the first time I've heard a discussion of this. I once tried to have a discussion like this in Australia, and there were just 2 people in the room, and the rest thought we were crazy. So where do you discuss such matters?
Okay, Charles, behind. And then I'll give you a chance to answer those 3 questions, and then we'll have another round.
Thank you. Charles Seaford. I'm afraid I also have a question for Oliver. Oliver, you've explained pretty convincingly why politicians have not taken up the rhetoric of well-being. But given what we heard this morning from the LSE research, that incumbent governments do very well electorally when well-being is going up? And given, as you said, that your constituents are themselves very concerned naturally about well-being, why do you think politicians in this country, as opposed to some other countries that we've heard about, are not very interested in the analysis of well-being that demonstrates what the drivers of well-being are, as opposed to the rhetoric?
Thank you. Perhaps we can have a first round at answering those questions. So I think the first question was really for the four of you. And perhaps, Minister, we can start with you on, because the way you presented it was really to get closer to the citizens. So has your initiative actually been successful? Do you feel that you've engaged with the citizens more and that the citizens now are more, I was going to say happier, but that's not what I meant. I mean, more conducive to considering, consider that you are closer to them, perhaps, than you were in the past. But breaking the silos, I think you've already explained very well what you're doing, but please.
So I think through the National Survey for Happiness and Positivity that we are conducting right now, we are reaching to our citizens and everyone living there in the United Arab Emirates, asking them about different aspects, asking them about the life satisfaction, life evaluation, happiness and positivity, asking them about their happiness about the education services, the health services, the community and culture, the infrastructure, the living standards and work. So by engaging them and understanding what are the happiness driver for each segment, we can become closer to them, and entities, whether Ministry of Health or Education, can tailor-make their policies according to the audience that they are serving.
Okay, yes, thank you. Do you want to tell us something? Do you feel that the citizens in Germany have realized or have thought that through this dialogue there was an improved conversation with the government or the parliament, perhaps?
No, that's
no.
But this is the first step for that. I'm not so pessimistic. I really can understand your feelings because during the last year, during the debate, there were so many big challenges for Germany, and we discussed about quality of care and well-being. And sometimes I also thought, oh my God, when the report will be finished, everybody will say this is esoterian and why do we deal with that? But I think that's the wrong attitude, because in the dialogue we learned, yes, the big challenges are important for people, but their own personal life, their circumstances is so important for them, and they want the government to improve it. And so I'm really convinced that for us, the dialogue for the government was a value on its own, because every member of the government must discuss with people, listen to people, and I think we learned a lot. That I can't say that this was a huge discussion all over the public. In some cases, when the Chancellor discussed, then a lot of people, yes, a lot of media reported, and I don't know if you know the conversation with the young refugee girl.
Oh yes,
this was one of our events about well-being, so it was not always very nice and esoterian, but really hard facts. But I think, yes, it will depend if or whether new governments, next governments will perpetuate that. But I think that a lot of governments work on that, work on well-being issues is a step forward, because now the GDP is not the only indicator for progress in society. So I become more optimistic during the dialogue.
So any answers to the questions, and in particular the questions on...
Yes, I mean, just briefly to answer the two specific points, come back to the general one. I mean, first of all, if academics are not willing to talk about this in this way to their students, we're lost. I mean, you have all the freedom in the world. Nobody elects you, and you're meant to be out there challenging. So you know, that ought to be easy. it seems to me interesting that these are subject. I mean, we've heard 3 other examples apart from the UK, and there are many others around the world. In fact, these are subjects that are discussed inside governments. They're actually also discussed inside cabinets. They're discussed between ministers from differing countries, in my experience. The place they're not discussed is on the hustings and in the media, in political debate. And that's the transformation we've got to achieve. And I hope you're right, and I think you may be right, that in due course we will change that. There's one reason for optimism, which is that from time to time these shifts have occurred. I mean, way back, the Puritans were interested in celebrating the idea of saving, and they turned the word thrift in the English language, which had been an insult, into a term of commendation. And in our own times, my lifetime, ecological sustainability, which was regarded as a joke concept 50 years ago, is now genuinely part of the political debate. And you can stand on a public platform in Britain and many other countries and talk about it and be taken seriously. Just as soon as you talk about either beauty or well-being in relation to it, that you get regarded as the lunatic eccentric. And I think that's really, in the end, the answer to Charles Seifert's point, that we have to overcome that ourselves. There's no short cut here. Politicians just have to be willing to go out there and use these facts and refer to these statistics and keep building this pattern until eventually people take it seriously. That's, I think, the only way forward. I do think that the point that was being made about overcoming the silos and getting back in touch with what it is that people actually care about is a very valid one. If government departments, I've seen this in many administrations around the world, focus simply on what it is that they are the government department for, and indeed start taking up positions which are the, quote, interest of that department, they are exactly counteracting the point of government, which is to do good things for the citizen, not to do good things for a government department and, quote, its agenda. And so the connection with the people is best engendered by breaking down the departmental silos. And I think we're seeing a very interesting example of that from the UAE, but actually we had our own experience of this too, and I think many other countries do, that actually from the centre of government you can use the actual effects that policies are having as a way of making government departments take seriously the proposition that they actually have to work together to achieve good effects. I mean, that sounds crazy. I mean, it sounds like it'd be the obvious thing to do, but we all know, actually, any of us who've ever operated in any bureaucracy, that actually people do start taking positions that conflict, and not because they have conflicting views about the end result, but because they have conflicting views about what will give them positional power inside government. And I think this is an engine for changing that.
Yes, I think we'll hear much more on the second panel, but just to concur with you just said, we conducted a study for China, and there was some discussion was about health, and in fact we concluded that there was no need to build any more hospitals in Beijing or anything, but it was to deal with the environment and environmental policy to deal with the health of the Chinese living in big cities. So if you don't break the silos and you continue doing policies in your own area, you're certainly missing the big objective about improving the lives of people. But do we see that breaking the silos in France?
I think on one aspect, I mean, the sort of administrative superstructure, I think it's we are moving in that direction through the obligation of having impact assessment and ex post assessment of policy decisions. But unfortunately, I think we haven't made any progress in terms of, in the wider public or in the media, having these dimensions to be taken all together and assessed in a sort of a holistic way. On that, I must say, over the last 2 years, I haven't seen any progress in that direction. But maybe, as Oliver said, maybe it's first for the state, basically, to have to put itself together, and then it will sort of be taken on by the media and by the wider public. They will understand. I mean, they would see the merits of not just looking at very sort of narrow dimensions, but to see it as a sort of a more global issue.
Okay, so we're going to take, there are lots of questions, so unfortunately, so I'm going to take the gentleman here, and then we move the two ladies afterwards, and Sama, if we have time, we'll get you as well. And then I'll move on to the other part of the room. Can you please stand up?
Chris Barrington Lee. I'm at McGill University in Montreal. And this is a question for relevant to sets of 46 or 10 indicators, other significant numbers that may be hard to communicate as a single one. Do you think there's value in using the science of subjective well-being, of life satisfaction, as we've heard about earlier this morning, in order to assign weights to those components, and then to feed to the press and public essentially a synthetic life satisfaction index, which is based on those chosen, maybe democratically, bottom-up chosen objective indicators? Thanks.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Sarah Stewart-Brown from the University of Warwick. I work in the world of health, and in many of our UK health documents, this little word well-being has been creeping in for quite a while. And I wonder if there's something there around health, because over the years, and I suppose for the last 10 years, I've been talking about mental well-being in the context of health. I am absolutely convinced that this agenda holds a lot to the solutions of our current NHS in this, that speaking to that agenda, we can make the NHS a possibility for the future rather than not. But I just wanted to pose something to the panel, which is a tad contentious. In my talking to people about mental well-being, I've seen a change over the course of the 10 years, and to begin with, there was a lot of negativity. And now there's much more not. But in that context, there's a gendered response. And it is, in my view, much more likely that women will just go, oh, yes, of course, and there will be more negativity. So as a predictor, as opposed to in this august audience where there are many examples of exceptions, I'd just like the panel's view on that.
Thank you for that question. Let's take another one. Yes, please.
Hi, yeah, my name's Fennel Waters. I work for the FCO in France. I'm not quite sure where this question fits in, but it just came to mind as we've been chatting. I'm actually asking how we address the well-being of the policymakers and all the others involved who put them into practice to begin with. We've talked a lot about trusting governments, and I think that includes trusting that they're in a position to move these to help everybody else. I know that if I'm not in a position to help myself, I certainly can't help others. So with that in mind, I know that the FCO survey, which is also for the first time being amalgamated with other departments across Whitehall, there's still people showing an awful amount of stress, anxiety, still having problems with line management and BHD. I also noticed that the OECD survey shows 60% of the participants showed high stress. And yet these are the cogs in the machine are trying to put these mutual objectives in place. I just wondered if that was something that had come up, and if it was, how you were addressing it.
I'm sorry. Okay, Sama, you just there. And then we'll see if we have time for more questions, but time is limited. We still have 10 minutes. Yes.
Sema Abdallah of multiple affiliations at the moment. I wanted to congratulate Minister Roumi for particularly that your national survey is including non-national citizens, because as many people know, the UAE has a large non-native population, so it's great to see that you're including them in the survey. And also to congratulate Vincent for the intention of reducing the number of indicators to make your project have a greater sort of appeal and a greater sort of ease of understanding. And we've been working at the New Economics Foundation to do with that sort of idea in mind. And our project was the 5 headline indicators of national success. So we went down from 10 to 5. But so maybe you'll get more resonance then. I wanted to ask a question which I guess is a little bit channeling Jeffrey Sachs's presentation from before lunch, where Professor Sachs was talking about this sort of difference between approaches where you're sort of the nudging approach, where you're sort of using the insights of well-being sort of surreptitiously under the radar, sort of trying to sort of quietly influence policy, but without making much noise about it, versus, I guess, is the alternative, which is the sort of the approach where we want politics and policy to be talking about virtue, or sort of being quite vocal and quite explicit about the intentions. And I think perhaps there's sort of a mix of those different methods on the panel. I just wanted to get your reflections on that.
Okay, since there are many more questions, perhaps what we can do, we're not going to answer all of those, but we'll have coffee breaks, a coffee break afterwards, so you can ask the question. So I'm going to pick a few more questions, and then you will pick up whichever question you want to answer, each of you, and then we'll move on to the coffee break, because I see a lady over there who's been asking for the floor desperately, and I would like to take her question, and then we'll have one more question. There was someone, yeah, there, and then I'm sorry, we'll have to stop. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Mary Fennick. I'm a journalist, so clearly I'm part of the problem. However, I also work as an executive coach, particularly for women in public life, so this might pull together some of the questions. I've been asked to do a proposal to support students at the Blavatnik School of Government in Oxford, so these are the policy makers of the future. And the piece of work that I'll be doing is how to support them as individuals to hold on to their own purpose in the face of the pressures of public service. So this is not a question, it's just to say that I'm here to translate all of this into practical support for the individuals of the future.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we now take the last question.
I'll just keep brief.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
I'm Neil Finn from University of Edinburgh. I work, a lot of my energies for the last 10, 15 years have been put into explaining to people who are primarily interested in social justice that you can't address social justice sensibly without talking about well-being. Conversely, however, you can't really talk about well-being policies and social happiness policies without talking sensibly about how much you're doing for social justice. Now, in the report that we discussed this morning, I happen to think that too much is conceded with talking about the removal of harms. But when I hear, for example, talking about Abu Dhabi working on happiness without conversing about the appalling forms of social injustice, human rights abuse, lack of democracy, I do think people are going to find it really struggle to take that seriously until those absolutely compelling social harms are not being more seriously addressed.
Okay, thank you. We're gonna answer I'm gonna ask the panel to answer those questions. But perhaps, Minister, you want to address this question immediately.
There was a question about the well-being of the policymakers, which I relate to a lot. So what we're trying to do in the UAE is to introduce some mindfulness practices to help policymakers to cope with the stress and the workload, because we move with the speed of light in the United Arab Emirates. And I was here 3 months ago. I learned about the experience of the UK Parliament and introducing mindfulness practices, and we're working with Oxford Mindfulness Centre on training government employees, how can they practice mindfulness, and talking about my personal experience, because I live in airplane, traveling from a country to another, juggling 2 jobs, but I have to remind myself that I have to be mindful, I have to work on myself to stay happy, because I'm the Minister of State for Happiness. So it's difficult, but it's a choice that we made, that I make every day, to be happy and to be positive. We will face challenges, but we need to look at to be optimistic and look at the bright side of things. The second question that I would like to talk about is the social behavior science, because happiness is cross-cutting. So for us in the UAE, it's not just the GDP per capita or the indicators, it's not just the health aspects or the education. We need to combine all sciences together as the science of happiness to help us develop policies or also empower people to choose to be happy.
Thank you. Eva?
Perhaps I can answer on the question about the numbers of indicators and an aggregate indicator. I wish that it would be possible to have one indicator in addition to the GDP, but I don't think that that will work, because you have to do so many simplicities and evaluation, and in my experience, it's not possible to agree on one indicator for that variety of well-being facets. And so we decided not to try it in any way, because I think the report wouldn't have been finished yet, and in the next decade. But let me mention that I don't want that government feels responsible for my personal well-being or for my life satisfaction. And I think to concentrate as a government, I could only talk for a government or for administration, to concentrate on the objectives, on the objective indicators, and then to show how complex the issues are is an important step to discuss with people how what kind of work government faces and what they could reach. I think that's that could be also a learning, not only for government but also for public and media, because well-being can't be one aggregate indicator. I don't think that this will work, and so we have to live with a difficult communication. But if we could reach that, for example, in Germany or in other countries, we could establish a regular report on that, then this could be in midterm, really influence policy measures on well-being. I'm really convinced on that. But it's a long way. It's not a short one.
Can you tell, did you, in your town hall discussions and dialogue, did you find some kind of a gendered perspective to the answers that you got about what matters? Did you? Of course, I haven't read the whole report, but did you?
Yes, of course. But I don't really understand the question. There is a different view on well-being between women and men, but also between the rural areas and the big cities. For example, we have a huge challenge of demographic development in Germany. And you could say this is a theoretical debate. No, it is not. Because in the town hall meetings, a lot of people talked about that because it really influences their personal life. People were frightened of the demographic change in their rural areas, for example. And we had a good balanced gender distribution in our town hall meetings. So I can't say that's only a female view on that, but I think the views are different, yes.
Okay. Oliver, do you want to make some remarks, in particular on this virtue versus nudging? Do you have any views on that? Or no, that's not, yeah.
But let me just first of all just pick up what's being said about the synthetic indicator question. Oh, sorry.
Closer to the mic.
Sorry. Let me first of all just pick up on the question of the synthetic single indicator. Actually, our positions are now reversed. I'm more optimistic than you are. The Legatum Institute has started producing a global prosperity index, which is, I think, the first sort of effort to do something of this kind. And I think it is imperative that the international statistical community gets to work on the question of something really robust, and that I mean, our own statisticians are contributing to that at the moment, but I think we need to work on that collectively around the world, because my own view is that actually this problem of getting this into the currency of political debate will only be overcome when there is one thing that we're all talking about. It's inevitably going to be imperfect in many, many respects, but it's better than actually just trying to have a conversation about 10 things where nobody can remember which thing they were just last talking about, and therefore nobody talks about it. Mm-hmm. And that brings me to the question of how explicit this is, and the question about sort of nudge versus open debate. I think what I'm trying to say is, I think we have, certainly in this country, grown up tremendously, and notwithstanding what I understand Professor Sachs may have said earlier in the day, which if he did say it, I don't agree with at all, about nudge. in the sense that I think across the administrative machine and actually increasingly outside it, people have begun to recognize that behavioral insights are a really powerful way of doing government and getting effective results, rather than just passing pieces of legislation that are unenforced and nobody pays any attention to and nothing actually happens that benefits the lives of the citizens. But I don't think we've grown up to the point yet where we've taken the idea of government trying to improve the life of the citizen into the political debate, so that the political debate becomes about how you improve the lives of citizens and not just how you achieve chunky results. And that's the effect I'm trying to, I'm advocating that we should participate in producing. And therefore, I'm trying to make something explicit and open and democratic that at the moment I think is going on inside bureaucracies, but is not really going on in politics.
Okay. Vincent?
Yeah. Maybe just a reaction on the number of indicators and the possibility of having a synthetic indicator. I was really interested by the presentation this morning of the book, because basically the comprehensive framework that you put forward, linking all the dimensions to the life satisfaction index, looks very promising to me, as you are able to quantify, although probably with some limitations, but the influence of each of the dimensions on the overall indicator, which is something, of course, that could lead to an ultimate synthetic indicator, which could be life satisfaction. But then I don't know if we are not missing, but I haven't read the book, so I don't know, it's probably in there, but I don't know if we are not missing the dimensions which are linked to future generations in when we are using such an indicator, and basically our footprint on our planet, for example, because people might not care that much about for their own personal life, but maybe they do, actually, and I believe they do, so maybe there is a way to reconcile that. I don't know.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we've run out of time. We're 5 minutes late, but we had a good conversation with this panel, I think, so please join me in thanking all the panelists.